you're doing lactate tests with triathletes, we are going to talk about 3 things you likely overlook, didn't think about, or maybe just missed out on. So before we start diving into that, let's remind ourselves, what are athletes actually looking for when they come to you to do a performance assessment, to do a lactate testing? Well, I would argue they're looking for 3 things. First thing, obviously, some benchmarking. They want to understand, did my numbers change? Did I improve? Did markers, metrics relevant to my performance in triathlon improve so that I'm actually progressing towards my goal? It's one likely question athletes are going to have for you when you test them. Second question is, how should I continue training? What kind of training intensity, training zones, what training methodologies, what should I be doing, to move forward? And also, especially when it's a test-retest situation, so when you tested the athlete before and now the athlete returns for follow-up assessment, one of the most common questions is, I want to use my lactate test to understand how did my training actually work out? How successful, how efficient was my training, right? So basically what you want to do, what athletes want to do is they want to look, so to speak, on what training they did and what was the outcome and see, did the training that I do propel me further or towards my goals? And the third thing is, which is often overlooked, they want security, they want confirmation, they want ease of mind, peace of mind, basically, to have you, the expert, tell them or reassure them, this is a training you should be doing. You have been on the right track. Here's where you maybe have been a little bit off. This is what you need to improve, right? Because it is really painful. It's a really uncomfortable feeling if, as an athlete, you do a training and it's constantly nagging you, asking yourself, is this training really the best I should be doing? Should I be doing something else? Maybe especially on a day or on a week or in a period where you don't feel that good. It's nagging the athletes. Is what I'm doing really the correct and the best training? Because let's face it, training time is scarce. It's precious. So the limited amount of time athletes investing into the training, they want to make sure that this is time well spent. So as a coach, as a trusted advisor, as an exercise physiologist, your goal is to provide those answers. And when you try to do this via lactate testing, there might be a few things that you haven't talked about, thought about, or have not incorporated your testing routine. And we are going to address those here today. So the 3 things we are going to talk about here are body composition, and therefore it's linked to gender specificity. Benchmarking, are we looking at the right benchmarks? Are we looking at the benchmarks that really matter? And 3, are we able to really measure and track progress by training of our athletes? Okay, so let's get straight into that. Body composition. Why body composition and gender matters in lactate testing? Let's do a little thought experiment here. I'm very sure you're maybe familiar or maybe actually working with numbers like VO2 max or watts per kilogram, for example, at a threshold intensity. So what you're doing here, you divide the amount of oxygen uptake, for example, milliliters per minute. You divide that by the body weight of the athlete because, a heavier athlete has higher numbers, lighter athlete has lower numbers, and therefore in order to be able to compare it, you need to divide it by the body weight in order to make it comparable and really have, so to speak, a meaningful number. Same with watts per kilogram. Now, when you test lactate, we always talk about lactate concentrations in 3, 4 millimoles, 5 millimoles, 10 millimoles, 2 millimoles, whatever. But in fact, it's not millimoles. It is actually millimoles per liter. So mathematically, it's the same operation as you do with milliliter per kilogram or milliliters per minute per kilogram for VO2 max or watts per kilogram. The difference is, in those cases, you know the kilograms, you know the body weight. But have you ever asked yourself, what are the actual liters? What is that liter? Because it's a concentration, what is that pool that, more precisely, scientifically speaking, that lactate distribution or dilution space actually? And this is often overlooked, right? So why does it matter? Because the lactate that you measure, the concentration that you measure, is actually the result of, as we're going to see, production and combustion of lactate. But it's, so to speak, at the end, what comes behind that is a lactate amount that is produced in the muscle, and then it dilutes in the body. And the more space it has to dilute, the lower the concentration is. It's like, simplified speaking, if you put 1 teaspoon of sugar into a cup of espresso or a cup of cappuccino. In both cases, it's a teaspoon of sugar, but obviously the concentration of sugar will be different because the bathtub, so to speak, the size of the compartment is bigger. And that's the same for lactate. So why does this matter specifically for triathletes? Is because, especially in triathletes, you will have periods, especially during winter training, for example, where athletes maybe focus more on swimming, or they even go into the gym. So they might put on some, for example, in this case, upper body mass, one scenario. Other scenario might be they may be a little bit overweight in the winter time, have a higher fat percentage in their body, and therefore have a lower water and muscle percentage, muscle content in the body. Okay, so lactate dilutes, as I just mentioned, in the water space, in some parts of the body where water is present, because lactate dilutes in water. So if there's more water, because somebody lost body fat or because they gained muscle mass, for example, upper body muscle mass by more swimming training and more gym training, what happens is you actually increase the dilution space. And what happens to your concentration of lactate that you measure, for example, during a bike test, the concentration gets lower. So picture that. You have an athlete doing a bike test, a follow-up test from the previous test. And cycling training has not been the main focus of this athlete. However, for a given workload, for a given power output, you measure a lower lactate concentration. This lower lactate concentration, 0.4, 0.5, 0.6 millimole, which is a significant, a big enough difference of lactate to compare to the previous test to say, okay, something changed, right? If you see a change of 0.4, 0.5, 0.6 millimole, you would interpret that as a change in the lactate curve. Now, this amount, this magnitude of change might not be funded or grounded in training adaptation of the leg muscles in terms of better cycling performance. This change might actually be grounded in the same amount of lactate got produced in the working muscles, means leg, lower limbs muscles, but now it dilutes in a bigger compartment. Because again, for example, less body fat, more muscle mass in the upper body. And that is something especially important when you also work with female triathletes. Because most, or actually, as far as I know, all lactate threshold concept incremental tests have been only validated with males and not with females. And females per se have a different body composition, higher fat, lower muscle mass, therefore lower water, than males. So you just cannot compare this one-to-one. So you have the problem of inter-athlete comparison, inter-individual comparison, males and females, and you also have the problem if you don't take into account the body composition in the lactate measurements. You also have the problems in the test-retest scenario. A higher or lower lactate concentration that you see at the same workload, same running speed, same power output, could just be because the body composition changed and not because there's a real change in performance. So with that, let's get to number 2, benchmarking. What does a triathlete want from a performance assessment in the field or in the lab? Athletes want to know, did they progress towards their goals? Did the benchmark, their performance indicator, so to speak, increase? So let's take a step back and think about which markers are important in triathlon. For example, you could argue, something maybe like running economy in the run. There's maybe aerodynamics on the bike. But from a physiological point of view, what matters? Well, turns out that in most triathlons, especially the ones longer than Olympic distance, so half distance or full distance, the most important metrics that define your performance in the race are actually carbohydrate combustion and fat combustion. How much carbohydrate can you spare, how much carbohydrates are burned, and how much fat is burned, because this will basically inform you the intensity you can go on the bike and on the run. So, is that question answered by a conventional lactate test? Very straightforward, it's not. As long as you don't hook up the athlete to a metabolic card and do a gas analysis, except for those cases which are restricted to human performance labs, laboratories, who have a metabolic cart which costs 10, 15, 25, 30 grams, depending on what device you're choosing, this analysis of fat and carb combustion, so to speak, is not accessible. And then, of course, because the machine is so expensive, such an analysis, such a test in a lab comes also at a certain price tag. So your simple lactate test, just looking at 2 millimoles, 3 millimoles, 4 millimoles, Dmax, whatever methodology you use, in relation to the power put on the bike or the running speed, does not tell you that information. So it does not reveal the most important metrics that triathletes do care about when it comes to race performance. That's another shortcoming, so to speak. And we're going to address that. Same with the body composition. We're going to address how you can fix that, okay? Actually, in the link here, okay, I do have not only a more detailed explanation, I also have a meta-analysis of body composition analysis, where there's one which just costs a couple of $100, which allows you to take into account this body composition problem. So number 3 of our list, what triathletes are looking for when they do lactate tests, is reassurance, security. They want to know if the training they have been doing actually worked in the way it was supposed to work. Did the training make them progress towards their goals? And for the upcoming training, for the training after a lactate test, what should they be doing? Okay, so have they improved? Did the training work? And what should they be doing going forward? That is the most important question for them psychologically, mentally. Because think about it, how difficult it is if you, as an athlete, want to understand, did I progress? Am I doing the right training? And especially in days or times where you don't feel this great, if you question your own training regime, if you question your own training program, that is a very uncomfortable feeling. So we do lactate tests, triathletes do lactate tests in order to find out, did I progress? And what you normally do to understand that, what is normally accepted is that we're looking for a right shift of the lactate curve. We're looking for a move of the curve to a higher power output, higher speed, basically a higher workload, right? And then the assumption is, if I have, therefore, at the same lactate concentration, a higher speed or power, or at a given speed or power, a lower lactate concentration, which basically is the same thing in terms of right shift, then I improved. And the big issue with that is not necessarily true. Let's step a little bit back here and think about what actually creates this lactate concentration that you measure. We already talked about the issue with the dilution space. Okay, forget about this for a second and think about the lactate concentration that you measure is actually the result of the lactate production, right? I mean, obviously it has to come from somewhere, and it comes from the glycolytic energy metabolism, right? From an anaerobic energy metabolism where glucose or glycogen is broken down, so to speak, into lactate. So this is where lactate is produced in the active working muscles. For example, in cycling, primarily in the leg muscles, obviously. And then this lactate is also combusted. Lactate is a fabulous fuel. It's a substrate used in the aerobic metabolism, which is where it gets oxidized. And that means that you not only have a lactate production, you also have a lactate combustion, a lactate oxidation. And that oxidation is proportional or depending on the oxygen uptake. It should make sense, right? If you think about it, if you want to oxidize something, you need oxygen for it. The more oxygen you have, basically saying the higher oxygen uptake, the more you can oxidize. So the higher oxygen uptake, the more lactate is combusted. And so now you face that problem that the lactate concentration that you measure is a result of both production and combustion or oxidation. And when the lactate curve shifts to the right, or it shifts to the left, or is not moving at all, you are not able to see with the blank eye if, for example, it moved to the right because the athlete combusted more lactate or produced less, okay? And therefore, you don't actually know. It's impossible. It's impossible to tell if the lactate curve shifted, for example, because of a higher aerobic capacity and improved VO2 max, which definitely would be one of the main goals the athlete is striving for, because a higher VO2 max means higher threshold value, it means better fat combustion, it means better aerobic fitness. So higher VO2 max is something you're looking for. So the lactate curve can shift to the right because of the higher VO2 max. But it can also shift to the right with an unchanged VO2 max or even a decreased VO2 max just because the lactate production is less. So you can also have a better VO2 max, an increased aerobic capacity with a left shift of the lactate curve. Because in this case, or this can happen when the VO2 max increased a little bit. So the lactate oxidation, lactate combustion increased only a little bit, but production increased much more. Then the curve will shift to the left. So long story short, left shift and right shift of lactate curve, and this is very well understood in the scientific literature, does not allow you to draw a conclusion what actually happened in training. It does not allow you to conclude, oh, the athlete has a higher aerobic fitness, or the athlete has, for example, more slow twitch fibers, less fast twitch fibers, and therefore less lactate production. So whatever conclusion you try to go to, whatever your goal was, right? Higher aerobic capacity, carbohydrate sparing, which would come along or go hand in hand also with less lactate production, you don't know. The lactate concentration doesn't tell you that. And this is heavily overlooked, and what happens is you see a right shift, you think the training was great, and the athlete might continue working into this direction, but in fact it was a right shift for the wrong reason, not what the athlete or you assumed, and therefore the training is now progressing into the wrong direction because it's basically, so to speak, confirming or false confirmation of a training that did do something. This is why the lactate curve shifted, but it maybe didn't do what you actually was looking for. So how do we solve that? Well, the good news is you can still do your normal lactate profile test, which looks something like something like I draw it here, where you have the time on the x-axis and then you have these blocks of load, right? This could be a running test. There's a short break in between where you take the lactate. Okay, so you can still do some kind of incremental test, but biomedical sciences have evolved since this incremental test has been invented 15 years ago. Computer science has evolved. So now you can do much more. So let me explain what you can do. You do your normal loads. In this example, let's say you have 4 load blocks going from a low intensity to high intensity. One block could be anything you want, anything you're currently doing. Maybe you do 3-minute blocks or 5-minute blocks, doesn't matter at all. Right? So you measure lactate before and you measure lactate after, right? And then you get a curve like this, okay? And then the only thing we would ask you to do is also to measure the peak lactate concentration afterwards. So you have maybe 7-8 lactate samples, okay? So this is the concentration. Now again, what is possible because of the involvement of mathematics, computer science, capabilities of hardware to process complicated algorithms and biomedical sciences, it is possible to understand the actual lactate production, right, that produces or is part of the creation of that concentration. So you would be able to see the actual lactate production, right, in those tests during those loads. And on top of that, it's possible to understand the actual lactate combustion, which is linked to the VO2. So the VO2 normally, right, in such a test would look like this, right? It goes a little bit down and then you have this mono exponential increase, and then towards the maximum, towards the end, you have the slow component, so it reaches some kind of maximum here. Okay, so what I'm saying here is that we can now use the measured lactate concentration in a conventional step test and disclose what was the actual lactate production that produced that lactate concentration and what was the lactate combustion, and therefore understand also what was the oxygen uptake, which means that you can also now understand what is the VO2 max of the athlete. So it is actually possible, let me make this crystal clear, to calculate lab precision VO2 max as precise as a lab level metabolic heart just from a conventional lactate profile test. I'm going to link the references down here in the article for you for that, okay, as well. So that is possible. And now you say, okay, that sounds a little bit nerdy, cool, nice to have that. But why is it so critical? Why is that such a breakthrough in conventional lactate testing? Well, let me explain you real quick. We already discussed that the lactate that is produced in the glycolysis. And glycolysis starts with glucose or glycogen, this very precious fuel for triathletes. So whenever the body wants to use glucose or glycogen as a fuel, it needs to feed it into the process called glycolysis, and what always comes out is lactate. So there's a proportional relationship between how much lactate is produced and how much glucose or glycogen has been combusted, which means by knowing the lactate production curve, we also directly know the actually glucose utilization rate in grams per minute, for example, if you want, because this is what is a useful information, a useful unit to express it in grams per minute. Okay, so now you can understand for your triathlete, without hooking them to a metabolic cart, what was my actually carbohydrate utilization as a function of power or running speed. Okay, and then on top of that, because we know the total energy expenditure, because we have the total workload, running speed, power output, and we know how much substrate, how much energy is derived from glucose utilization, we know that the remaining energy comes from fatty acids. So by knowing glucose utilization, we also directly understand fat combustion. So that means with a conventional lactate test, we basically are able to get a lab precision VO2 max. We are able to get lab precision carbohydrate utilization rate and fat combustion rate. In order to do that, we need the body composition. So we tick that box already. I've said I'm going to link you this meta-analysis of the body composition analysis. So there is one, again, just $250, which solves that. You need a lactate meter, $250, $300. So around $500, you're all set up to do a complete lactate test in, if you do the math here, about 15 minutes, okay, of testing. You get a full metabolic profile, including VO2 max, including substrate utilization. So you have all the metrics that you actually need for coaching, for analyzing, for assessing the performance of a triathlete, right? Without the overhead of doing a separate incremental test for substrate utilization, a separate REM test for VO2 max, without the need to hook up to a metabolic cart, and so on and so forth. Okay, so check out the article below, where this is all described in more detail, and where you can find also, again, the scientific references, so you can understand that what I presented here is not just as an idea or a concept, but it's actually steeped in peer-reviewed science.